The heavy glass revolving doors of the grand towering Vanguard structure turned with a quiet, expensive hum as Madeline Davis stepped into the vast, echoing marble lobby of the Sterling corporate tower. The cold autumn rain of Seattle was hammering relentlessly against the massive, clean glass facade of the skyscraper, blurring the endless grid of glowing red and white car taillights that choked the busy streets down below. Madeline walked with a slow, perfectly measured grace, her high heels clicking softly against the polished stone floor like the steady, ominous ticking of an ancient clock, moving closer toward a destined explosion. She looked at the wealthy, high-society guests who were laughing and drinking expensive champagne under the brilliant warmth of the massive crystal chandeliers, fully aware that this specific night would not just mark her husband's grand ascension. Raymond believed he was effortlessly throwing away a beautiful, completely silent, and entirely useless ornament of a wife, completely oblivious to the fact that this quiet woman, walking gracefully by his side, was the only reason his crown was safe. Madeline quietly observed the misty city landscape through the wide glass, without once touching the crystal glass of champagne that an attentive waiter had placed in her steady hand nearly 20 minutes ago. Her deep blue gown traced the serene, unyielding line of her shoulders, while her clear eyes held the dangerous, unwavering calm of an elite chess player who had thoroughly understood the entire board game. On the glamorous, crowded opposite side of the sprawling ballroom, Raymond Sterling was flashing his practiced, charismatic smile at a wealthy circle of international investors, powerful politicians, and sharp-faced corporate lawyers. Earlier that evening, he had been officially announced as the brand-new Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Global, a massive conglomerate specializing in logistics, shipping ports, and trade finance that spanned across the nation. His aging father, Arthur Sterling, who had been abruptly sidelined due to severe health issues, remained seated in a discreet wheelchair near the velvet-draped wall, surrounded by private doctors and assistants. Raymond's sophisticated mother, Beatrice, glided elegantly between the wealthy guests with a rigid, icy pride, acting as if her son's brand-new executive title were a priceless diamond she had personally ordered to be polished. Raymond was the natural heir to this vast empire, but he was also a man profoundly prone to confusing loud, sycophantic applause with genuine operational competence, moving through the crowd with absolute confidence. He crossed the luxurious room with smooth, calculated steps, greeting every single person as if he were generously distributing invisible financial favors, his tall frame marked by a deep-seated arrogance. Standing far too close to him was Lillian Vance, the brilliant director of institutional relations for Sterling Global, who laughed softly at his jokes while keeping her hand resting on his arm. Madeline witnessed the intimate gesture from across the room, but she did not flinch, nor did she feel even a single flicker of surprise, as her capacity for surprise had died many months ago. She had discovered the first suspicious financial transfer linked to a shell company hidden deep within Raymond's private digital archives, revealing that his cheap marital betrayal was merely the most vulgar part of a larger conspiracy. Lillian Vance moved through the high society crowd like a predator who knew the exact financial price of every single human weakness, possessing a sharp beauty and a voice that turned sweet whenever an audience watched. She frequently glanced across the crowded room at Madeline with a rehearsed smile of pure pity, the exact kind of condescending look that arrogant people use when they believe they have already won the game. What Lillian did not know was that Madeline had spent her entire youth quietly studying corporate crises, complex shareholder disputes, and intricate forensic accounting, while Lillian was merely learning to survive. On this fateful night, one of them saw nothing more than a wealthy marriage coming to a bitter end, while the other saw a massive chessboard, whose pieces were about to be scattered. Beatrice Sterling approached Madeline from behind, making absolutely no effort to hide the deep contempt she had carefully cultivated since the very first day her son brought Madeline home. To the cold-hearted matriarch, her daughter-in-law was far too beautiful to be trusted, and far too quiet to possess any real intelligence, as she had never accepted a woman without an elite pedigree. Even though Madeline had never once asked the Sterling family for money or social influence, Beatrice firmly believed that an ideal corporate wife should only smile at charity dinners and disappear when business was discussed. Madeline, out of a brilliant mixture of traditional politeness and long-term strategy, had intentionally allowed them to believe she was foolish for long enough, knowing that letting your enemy underestimate you is the cleanest strategy. "You are remarkably quiet tonight, Madeline," Beatrice remarked coldly, tightening her grip on her designer handbag as she stood side by side with her. "An important milestone like this demands a certain regal posture, and we certainly do not want our distinguished guests to think there is any sort of marital trouble between you and Raymond." Madeline turned her face slowly toward her mother-in-law, letting the warm brilliance of the crystal chandeliers touch her pale skin, though the bright light did absolutely nothing to soften the fierce determination in her eyes. She deliberately chose not to answer immediately because she had learned long ago that silence, when weaponized correctly, forces arrogant people to listen closely to their own growing insecurities. Beatrice tightened her thin lips with visible impatience, as that unshakable, quiet calm had irritated her far more than any loud confrontation ever could since the wedding day. If Madeline had broken down and cried, Beatrice could have easily labeled her as weak. If she had screamed, she could have dismissed her as vulgar. But when Madeline simply observed them in silence, Beatrice felt exposed. It was as if her entire life's vanity were nothing more than a poorly drafted legal document waiting to be completely torn apart by a superior analytical mind. "Do not worry yourself, Beatrice," Madeline finally replied in a low, resonant voice that carried an undeniable weight. "This evening will be remembered by everyone in this room exactly as it deserves to be." The polite response seemed harmless on the surface, but something deep within the icy tone sent a sudden chill down Beatrice's spine, shaking her confidence for a brief second. Before the matriarch could formulate a sharp retort, Raymond raised his crystal glass in the center of the ballroom, loudly calling for the room's undivided attention. The wealthy guests immediately turned toward him, and the expensive murmur of corporate gossip died down, replaced by the rhythmic sound of the heavy rain hammering against the glass. Madeline remained exactly where she stood, refusing to claim her rightful place by her husband's side, refusing to smile for the flashing cameras of the business press, feeling an old ache in her chest. She knew with absolute certainty that loving someone does not obligate a woman to kneel down before the spectacular ruin that the man has willfully chosen to build for himself. Raymond began his grand speech by smoothly thanking the board of directors, the wealthy institutional shareholders, and the executive team that had supposedly sustained the conglomerate through transformation. He did not mention Madeline's name even once, not out of a sudden lapse of memory, but out of a deeply ingrained habit of erasing her contributions from his life. She had heard various versions of that exact same speech during smaller business dinners, private board meetings, and carefully rehearsed television interviews over the years. He always spoke eloquently about personal courage, strategic vision, and relentless discipline. Beautiful, expensive words that felt entirely empty when coming from a man utterly incapable of admitting help. Madeline silently recalled the countless exhausting midnights she had spent meticulously reviewing and fixing complex international shipping contracts that Raymond would blindly sign the next morning without reading. Standing in the very front row of the cheering crowd, Harrison Brooks was applauding with a calculated, exaggerated enthusiasm that matched his position as the senior vice president of global operations. Harrison was Raymond's most trusted confidant within the executive suite, a man blessed with a wide, friendly smile and eyes that were far too narrow to be trusted. Madeline had been quietly tracking his movements for more than 2 years, discovering that he had slowly constructed a massive, hidden web of ghost suppliers and inflated logistics contracts. Raymond saw in Harrison a fiercely loyal executive who helped him beat quarterly earnings expectations. But Madeline saw a patient, dangerous predator who was slowly bleeding the company dry. She had initially tried to warn her husband months ago without exposing her entire hand at once, knowing that an accusation without bulletproof evidence would fail. Raymond had simply laughed in her face, mockingly calling her strategic concerns nothing more than domestic paranoia born out of pure boredom, completely dismissing her analytical mind. After that humiliating day, Madeline completely stopped warning her husband, and instead began documenting every single corporate crime with a mathematical precision that left no room for error. When the grand executive speech finally came to an end, the glass ballroom exploded into a thunderous wave of applause, and Raymond was instantly surrounded by wealthy men. Lillian Vance stepped forward and kissed him on the cheek, her lips lingering dangerously close to the corner of his mouth in a way that signaled absolute possession to everyone. Some people in the crowd quickly looked away, pretending they had not seen the scandalous display, while others noted it down to gossip about during lunch the following afternoon. Madeline left her untouched champagne glass on a nearby mahogany table and walked calmly toward the quiet, dimly lit side corridor, where the private executive boardrooms were located. She knew with absolute certainty that Raymond would send someone to call her into one of those soundproof rooms, far away from the prying eyes of guests. Men like Raymond always prefer to inflict their worst humiliations in private, especially when they still need to maintain a public image of perfect elegance and chivalry. She also knew that Lillian would make absolutely sure to be standing nearby, wearing a fake mask of innocence, while the trap was successfully sprung. The long executive corridor was lined with expensive dark walnut paneling and cold abstract artwork selected by high-priced corporate art consultants, pieces that were incredibly costly, yet entirely devoid of warmth. Madeline stopped for a brief moment before the heavy boardroom doors, sliding her gold wedding band off her finger and feeling the faint, indented mark it left behind. It was a small physical reminder of a sacred promise she had taken completely seriously, even when her husband had already begun treating her as an accessory. She placed the ring deep inside her handbag and took a long, steady breath, realizing there was no longer enough hatred left inside her heart to make this moment painful. What remained was a terrifyingly clear lucidity, and lucidity is often much more cruel than anger because it refuses to allow you the comfortable illusion of going back. The heavy door behind her clicked open, and Raymond appeared without his charming public smile, followed closely by Lillian, who was pretending to check urgent emails. Beatrice walked in as if her son's cruelest decision were her own personal victory, her face frozen in a look of absolute triumph over the daughter-in-law she despised. Harrison Brooks did not enter the room, but he remained clearly visible at the far end of the quiet hallway, casually speaking with an assistant while keeping his narrow eyes fixed on the door. Madeline carefully registered every single presence, every precise distance, and every subtle attempt at psychological control, not out of fear, but out of a deeply ingrained habit. She knew that environments of absolute power always reveal far more through the physical positioning of the people in the room than through the carefully practiced phrases. "Madeline," Raymond said, his voice dropping its warm public tone and turning incredibly cold as he shut the door behind them. "We need to resolve a private matter before this evening officially comes to an end." She walked into the spacious room without asking for permission, noting the long mahogany conference table, the expensive leather chairs, and the stunning view of the rain-slicked city. Resting on the center of the table was a sleek black leather folder, already opened to reveal neatly organized legal papers and a luxury fountain pen waiting. Madeline recognized the structure of the document instantly, without even needing to touch the pages. It was an aggressive divorce petition prepared by the most expensive matrimonial lawyers. The clauses were meticulously designed to ensure she walked away with the absolute minimum amount of assets possible, while forcing her into a lifetime of strict silence. She almost smiled at the sheer pathetic timing of it all, realizing that even in his cruelty, Raymond was entirely too late to save his empire. She had already prepared her own definitive exit strategy long before he ever gathered the arrogant courage to throw her out of his life and his home. Raymond stood by the head of the table, while Lillian leaned discreetly against the wide glass window, and Beatrice sat down in a leather chair comfortably. Madeline remained standing, and her refusal to sit down seemed to deeply irritate Raymond, who pulled a heavy chair out for himself but chose not to sit. He desperately wanted to physically dominate the space, but her complete, unshakable serenity made that corporate power play incredibly difficult for him to execute successfully. "I am not going to drag this out," Raymond began, crossing his arms and looking at her with a hard, unyielding gaze. "The current situation between the two of us has become entirely insupportable, and as I assume a much greater global responsibility tonight, I need a life that is perfectly aligned with my brand new executive moment." "Your brand new executive moment," Madeline repeated softly, her voice entirely devoid of any anger, carrying only a faint trace of undeniable irony that cut through his speech. Raymond narrowed his eyes at her calm demeanor, his frustration growing with every passing second. "Yes, my moment. This conglomerate demands a powerful modern image, a true partner who fundamentally understands the immense weight of standing by my side at the top of the world. You have never truly adapted to this life, Madeline. You have never demonstrated a single ounce of corporate ambition. You have never shown any real interest in the business world I live in, and you have simply never understood the sheer scale of the global work I do every single day." Beatrice let out a soft, satisfied sigh from her chair, as if every single cruel sentence her son spoke were a glorious confirmation of her own decades of bitter judgment. Lillian kept her eyes lowered toward her phone, but she could not completely hide the triumphant smile spreading across her attractive face. Madeline looked directly at her husband with a deep, silent calm that began to noticeably unnerve him, as he had fully expected tears, desperate accusations, or perhaps a pathetic plea. He had expected her to hysterically ask if there was another woman, desperately wanting her to lose her composure so he could use her anger. But Madeline merely listened to his words, and a woman who can listen to her own expulsion without falling apart has already completely escaped the jurisdiction of the man. Raymond impatiently pushed the heavy black folder across the polished mahogany table, the papers sliding smoothly over the wood until they stopped directly in front of her. "Our family lawyers have taken care of every single detail. You will be allowed to live in our smaller apartment for exactly 6 months, and you will receive a reasonable financial compensation in exchange for absolute, unbreakable discretion moving forward. You will make no public statements to the business press, you will not contact any journalists, and you will not interfere in any matter whatsoever related to the Sterling family or global operations." Madeline quietly looked down at the legal papers, noting that the word discretion was repeated in almost every single clause, finding it darkly amusing how guilty people always use that word. She gently touched the first crisp page with the tips of her fingers, not to read the unfair terms, but to firmly mark this exact transitionary instant within her mind. Raymond completely misinterpreted the quiet gesture as a sign of hesitation, and immediately chose to harden his voice, wanting to crush any remaining resistance. "Do not make this an embarrassing public scene, Madeline. You know very well that you do not have the financial structure or the legal power to face our family in a court battle. I genuinely do not want to hurt you, but I will absolutely not allow your personal vanity to get in the way of my corporate future." For the very first time that evening, a subtle change appeared on Madeline's face. But it was not a look of sadness. It was a cold, detached species of pity. Raymond spoke about the future as if it were a private piece of real estate that he exclusively owned, acting as if she had spent years by his side, merely occupying empty space. He had completely forgotten the exhausting nights she spent preventing him from signing disastrous maritime agreements, and he did not remember the billionaire investor whom she had personally convinced. He had entirely erased the secret internal audit she had quietly conducted to ensure the company's books were clean before his grand promotion, or perhaps he remembered it all, but preferred to call it a coincidence. "Do you honestly believe that I am the one standing in the way of your corporate future, Raymond?" Madeline asked, her voice steady and clear, echoing in the quiet room. The question was entirely too simple, and because of its simplicity, it made him feel remarkably uncomfortable. He blinked, cleared his throat, and stepped closer to the head of the table. I know for a fact that our marriage has become a heavy operational weight. You are a beautiful woman, Madeline, and absolutely no one in this family denies that. But simple beauty cannot sustain the complex life of a man in my executive position. Lillian took a deep, satisfied breath by the window, while Beatrice crossed her legs, staring intently at Madeline, as if she were finally about to see her break down. Instead of crying, Madeline calmly picked up the luxury fountain pen from the table. Raymond blinked in pure shock at the absolute speed of her reaction, as she read only the first 2 lines to confirm the legal structure before signing her name with a firm hand. She signed the first copy without a single tremor, without a dramatic pause, then immediately turned to the duplicate copy and did the exact same thing. The sharp sound of the pen scratching against the crisp paper seemed louder than the heavy rain outside, louder than the distant music of the ballroom, and louder than their breath. Raymond stood entirely frozen, as the absolute ease with which she signed away their marriage completely robbed him of the grand legal victory he had spent weeks rehearsing. Lillian's triumphant smile vanished for a fraction of a second, and Beatrice was the very first to react, wrinkling her forehead in deep annoyance at the lack of tears. "Is that truly all you have to say?" the matriarch asked, unable to contain the sharp bitterness in her voice. "Are you not going to offer any defense?" Madeline capped the luxury pen and placed it back on top of the black folder, with perfect care, her movements slow and deliberate. "What exactly would you like me to say, Beatrice? Would you like me to loudly acknowledge my place? I want you to admit that you finally understand this family has always been infinitely larger and more powerful than you could ever hope to be," Beatrice snapped back, unable to hide her malice. Madeline looked directly into her eyes, her gaze completely devoid of any anger, holding only a deep tranquility that felt entirely unsupportable to the older woman. For decades, Beatrice had used her old family name, massive wealth, and high society traditions as deadly weapons to crush anyone who opposed her. But Madeline possessed a completely different power. True power was knowing exactly where the real financial documents were buried, understanding the secret fear hidden behind an executive signature, and protecting the working-class people whom the wealthy did not name. Power was being able to walk out of a room without ever needing to raise your voice, leaving everyone inside completely trapped within their own deep ignorance. "I understand many things tonight, Beatrice," Madeline said softly, her voice calm and steady. "Far more than you could ever possibly imagine." Raymond took an aggressive step forward, his face flushing with frustration at her complete lack of fear. "You are trying to act mysterious, Madeline, but it is not going to work on me. You signed the papers, and from this exact second onward, you will follow your path, and I will follow mine." "Yes," Madeline replied, her voice filled with a calm certainty that sent a sudden, unexplained wave of panic through his chest. "You will certainly follow yours." The sentence should not have frightened him, but it did, precisely because there was absolutely no bitterness or hatred left in her tone. She spoke like someone who had already seen the entire map of the road ahead and knew exactly where the dead end was located. Raymond felt a sudden wave of irritation because the psychological control of the room was slipping away from him in a way he could not logically explain. He had planned this conversation as a definitive closing chapter, but her serene posture was transforming the moment into the opening of something completely unknown. Lillian decided to intervene, stepping forward and using the sweet, fake tone she usually reserved. "Madeline, I truly hope that one day you will understand. Raymond simply needs someone who is perfectly compatible with his immense corporate greatness," Lillian said smoothly. "There is absolutely no shame in accepting that some people are born to merely follow, while others are born to build kingdoms." Madeline turned her head toward Lillian, with a look of polite, undivided attention, and for a long second, the silence in the room grew so heavy that even Beatrice looked uncomfortable. Lillian maintained her fake smile, but her manicured fingers tightened around her phone until her knuckles turned white, as there was something in Madeline's gaze that made her feel transparent. It was as if all of her secret financial calculations, her deleted text messages, her private meetings with Harrison, and her empty promises were clearly written across her skin. "You are actually right about one specific thing, Lillian," Madeline said, her voice cutting through the quiet room like a diamond. "Some people do spend their lives building, while others spend their lives merely following. And then, there are those who spend their entire lives secretly stealing the bricks of others, just so they can pose proudly in front of a house they never had the strength to build themselves." Lillian's face hardened into a mask of pure fury for a fraction of a second, and Raymond slammed his hand down on the mahogany table with the explosive impatience of a man who had completely lost control. "That is enough. I will absolutely not tolerate your petty personal insults in this room." Madeline did not move an inch, her eyes remaining fixed on his angry face, her composure unbroken. "Then I suggest you stop tolerating the massive lies that are currently standing right next to you." The heavy response hung in the quiet air of the boardroom like an unexploded bomb, and Raymond opened his mouth to shout, but closed it immediately as a sudden, terrifying instinct made him want to ask exactly what she knew. He chose not to ask because his immense pride was a heavy set of handcuffs that kept him locked in his own ignorance, preferring to dismiss her warning. Men like Raymond always choose to label a woman's brilliant intelligence as emotional instability whenever they are terrified of what that intelligence might expose. Madeline calmly picked up her handbag, reached inside and pulled out a clean, thick white envelope, placing it gently on the polished table, right next to the signed divorce papers. Raymond stared down at the white envelope, as if it were a piece of dangerous contraband. "What exactly is this?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly, despite his best efforts to remain firm. "Consider it a final piece of corporate courtesy," Madeline replied smoothly, as she walked toward the heavy boardroom door. "You should probably read it only when you are completely alone." Beatrice let out a short, forced laugh from her chair, trying to recapture her superior air. "We do not have the time for your dramatic little games, Madeline. The real drama is what you and Harrison have done to an entire global conglomerate," Madeline said, her hand resting on the brass door handle. "What happens next is simply the natural consequence of your actions." She opened the heavy door and stepped out into the quiet executive corridor before Raymond could even think of a response, her heels clicking softly against the floor. Harrison Brooks quickly looked away from his phone as she approached, pretending to end an important business call, but as Madeline walked past him without a word of greeting, he felt a sudden, cold wave of sweat break out. He quickly convinced himself it was nothing more than personal antipathy. Completely unaware that his name appeared on encrypted copies of financial records stored in 3 separate secure locations. He had absolutely no idea that Madeline had spent months mapping out his network of ghost suppliers, his indirect bribery payments, his discreet meetings in boutique hotels, and his duplicated maritime invoices. He did not know that the simple white envelope resting on the boardroom table was the very first stone displaced from a massive corporate dam that was about to burst wide open. Raymond remained standing in front of the empty table, staring down at his wife's elegant signature on the divorce papers, having fully imagined that this moment would make him feel completely free. Instead, he felt strangely diminished and hollow, as if Madeline had quietly carried away something vital from his life that he could not yet name. Lillian stepped closer to him, placing her hand firmly back on his shoulder and using her softest voice to soothe his bruised ego. "You did the right thing, Raymond. Now the dead weight is gone, and you can finally begin your true executive life at the top of Sterling Global." Raymond nodded slowly, but his eyes refused to leave the white envelope resting on the mahogany table, while Beatrice stood up from her chair with a satisfied smile. Lillian tried to gently pull Raymond toward the door, but he remained completely frozen in place, as something about Madeline's final sentence continued to claw at his mind. "The real drama is what you have done to an entire global conglomerate." That did not sound like the emotional parting words of a heartbroken, jealous wife. It sounded like the cold, structured accusation of a senior prosecutor. And in the high-stakes world of global logistics, structured accusations were almost always accompanied by bulletproof documentation. Madeline stepped into the private executive elevator alone, the heavy metal doors sliding shut to lock out the distant sound of the high society music, leaving her in a quiet world of brushed steel. She watched her own reflection in the metallic walls, noting that, though her face was pale from months of exhausting secrecy, her eyes were completely unbroken. For years, she had genuinely believed that her immense patience could save their marriage, that her deep love could slowly educate his pride, and that her absolute loyalty would eventually be recognized without her ever needing to announce it. Now, as the elevator glided smoothly toward the ground floor, she understood that some people only begin to recognize the true value of a person when the sudden absence begins to collect heavy interest. Raymond was about to pay his interest, not because she possessed a petty desire to destroy his life, but simply because he had willfully chosen to protect the criminals around him. When the elevator doors opened into the grand marble lobby, the vast space was almost entirely empty, the security guards stepping forward to greet her with their usual automatic respect. They were clearly wondering if they should still address her as Mrs. Sterling, after seeing her leave the executive floor alone on the night of her husband's biggest triumph. Madeline noticed their subtle hesitation and offered them a gentle, reassuring smile, not for their comfort, but for her own, realizing that the famous family name everyone believed to be her greatest social privilege had never truly been her identity. Outside the towering glass entrance, the heavy rain had finally begun to slow down into a cool, misty fog that hung over the streets. A sleek black sedan immediately pulled up to the curb, and the driver, Paul, a loyal employee who had worked for Madeline's father for more than a decade, stepped out quickly with a wide umbrella. "Good evening, Mrs. Madeline," Paul said respectfully, opening the heavy rear door for her. Madeline stepped inside the quiet car, and only when the door clicked shut did she finally allow her tense shoulders to relax, leaning her head against the soft leather seat. Paul closed his umbrella and took his place behind the steering wheel, turning the vehicle smoothly onto the wet, dark avenue. He did not ask her a single question about what had transpired on the 48th floor, as there are some rare people whose loyalty is so deep and absolute that it requires no words. Resting on the seat right next to her was a secure, military-grade laptop computer that had been quietly waiting for her arrival. Madeline flipped the screen open, and the bright blue light immediately revealed an urgent, encrypted message from Claire Miller, her brilliant corporate attorney and closest friend of 20 years. The data lines showed that the forensic audit portfolio had been successfully received by the Federal Regulatory Board, and the asset protection injunction had been officially filed in the court records. Madeline read the status lines twice to ensure there were no errors, then closed her eyes for a long moment, letting the quiet hum of the car engine fill her mind. Upstairs in the brilliant ballroom, Raymond was still being toasted by wealthy men, but down here in the damp silence of the midnight city, a massive shift was already beginning to take place. Absolutely no one in that building knew that 3 major international banks had just received formal requests to review the corporate guarantees of Sterling Global. No one knew that 2 massive investment funds had been officially alerted to severe, hidden operational risks within the company's maritime divisions. No one knew that the working-class families of men who had been severely injured in unrecorded port accidents would finally have elite legal representation capable of fighting the corporate machine. Back in the soundproof boardroom, Raymond finally reached out and picked up the thick white envelope that Madeline had left behind, Lillian having left the room to quickly touch up her makeup. The vast room was completely silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning as he tore the heavy paper open with a wave of growing irritation. He fully expected a long, sentimental letter filled with emotional guilt, or perhaps a final, pathetic attempt to make him feel ashamed of his infidelity. Instead, his eyes fell upon a single crisp sheet of paper containing less than 10 lines of text and a certified copy of an internal maritime safety report marked with highly confidential corporate security codes. His own executive signature appeared at the bottom of a formal emergency authorization linked to their massive shipping terminal. Below his signature, a short note written in Madeleine's elegant handwriting read, "Not every executive signature is a sign of true leadership, Raymond. Sometimes, it is merely the bulletproof evidence that a powerful man did not bother to read what he was signing." Raymond felt the hot blood immediately rush to his face, his first primal reaction being a wave of pure, unadulterated rage that his wife would dare to leave such a document. But his second reaction was a cold, sharp wave of panic that hit his stomach so fast he almost couldn't breathe. He immediately picked up his phone and called Harrison Brooks, his vice president of operations, answering on the very first ring with a voice that was entirely too cheerful. "Harrison, I need you to come back to the private boardroom right this second," Raymond ordered, his voice tight and completely devoid of its usual warmth. "And make absolutely sure you come alone." Harrison hesitated for a fraction of a second on the other end of the line before maintaining his smooth, professional tone. "Of course, Raymond. Did something unexpected come up with the investors?" Raymond looked back down at the certified maritime report, the thin lines of rain sliding down the glass window behind him like long, transparent fingers. "I am not entirely sure yet," Raymond replied coldly, "but I am about to find out." The profound journey of Madeleine Davis and the ultimate collapse of the Sterling dynasty offer an invaluable blueprint for the mature soul, reflecting upon the deep, often hidden currents of human existence. As we advance through the autumn of our lives, the glittering illusions of worldly success, the grand titles, the towering structures of glass and steel, the expensive jewelry, and the loud, sycophantic applause of high society, begin to naturally lose their blinding luster, revealing the stark, undeniable truth that the real value of a human life is never determined by what we display, but by what we choose to protect in the quiet dark. We live in a world that is deeply, tragically obsessed with the loud performance of power, where arrogant men frequently confuse an executive signature with genuine leadership, and where a woman's patient, gentle silence is foolishly dismissed as a sign of intellectual inferiority or social compliance. Yet, this story stands as an unyielding testament to the magnificent, terrifying reality that silence is often the quiet laboratory of a superior mind, a sacred space where facts are meticulously gathered, where evidence is carefully weighed, and where the unshakable foundation of a righteous justice is built brick by brick, entirely out of the sight of the predator. It reminds us with absolute clarity that we must never make the fatal error of underestimating a human being simply because they possess the rare, regal discipline to endure a temporary humiliation without screaming, for they are often the very ones who are quietly mapping out the exact territory of your ruin, waiting with an absolute patience for the precise historical instant to turn the page and let the truth speak for itself. Furthermore, this narrative forces us to look deeply into the mirror of our own personal relationships and family structures, laying bare the painful truth that a marriage or a family built exclusively upon the shifting sands of mutual vanity, corporate convenience, and the systematic erasing of another's contributions is nothing more than a beautiful, gilded prison that will inevitably come crashing down when the storms of reality hit. True love can never exist where there is a complete absence of profound respect, and whenever a man chooses to treat his wife as a temporary social ornament while blindly trusting the flattering liars who feed his massive ego, he is voluntarily signing the definitive warrant for his own moral bankruptcy. Power without an absolute responsibility is a dangerous, infectious disease that turns human beings into cold statistics, transforming an empire into a modern machine that crushes the weakest and the most vulnerable simply to protect a quarterly profit margin or a famous surname. But as the wise and the mature well know, the moral laws of the universe are completely non-negotiable. You can buy expensive lawyers, you can manipulate the high society press, and you can isolate the voices of the suffering for years. But the truth remains completely patient, entirely watertight, and utterly unbroken by the passing of time. In the end, The spectacular fall of Raymond Sterling teaches us that true redemption can never be cheaply bought with a beautiful public relations apology or a calculated financial settlement. It requires a man to be entirely willing to stand in the open light of day, strip away his inherited pride, and fully accept the terrifying consequences of his own blindness. True victory did not arrive for Madeleine when she successfully brought a corporate vice president to justice, or when she forced a global conglomerate to bow to her strategic will. Her true, everlasting triumph was the absolute, definitive possession of her own moral soul, proving to the world that dignity never implores for recognition, that character can never be bought by old money, and that the quietest heart in the room is often the one that carries the unshakable thunder of the absolute truth.